Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Confederation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure to rise today to speak on Bill C-37. This bill would amend the minister's powers and discretion when it comes to approving drug injection sites in communities across Canada. It would remove community safeguards and put these important decisions entirely in the hands of a single minister and not in the hands of a local community. Mr. Speaker, in an ideal world, we would not have to deal with this issue of drug addicts and where they choose to consume their deadly drugs, but we do. And in an ideal world, drug abuse and the crime it causes in our communities would not be something we have to face, but it is. And in an ideal world, Mr. Speaker, every addict would be on the road to recovery and the success rate would be 100%. That is just not the case. In reality, Mr. Speaker, drug abuse has been around as long as anyone can remember, and it is getting worse. Literally, people are dying every day from their addiction and drug abuse. Many years ago, Mr. Speaker, before I entered politics, I served on the Alberta Alcohol and Drug Abuse Commission, or ADAC, and I served on there for a number of years. And I learned a lot about drug addiction and the incredible pain that it causes. And the experience there affirmed to me why we should never deal with drugs in a cavalier manner. Mr. Speaker, Canada already has good legislation in place to permit drug consumption sites or safe injection sites, whatever you want to call it. But let me stress before I continue that there is no such thing as a safe injection site, as there is nothing safe about drug injection and the abuse of drugs. The Liberals and the NDP claim that this current legislation is so onerous that no organization can succeed in getting a drug consumption site approved. Yet, we see that this government approved 3 of them in Montreal earlier this month. This proves the current legislation does strike a good balance. Now, referring to the current legislation and its purpose, the Supreme Court of Canada has set out clear criteria that must be met before a drug consumption site can be approved. One pillar of the current Conservative legislation was strong community consultation, which the Supreme Court agreed was essential. These consultations were not meant as a way to prevent sites from opening, but rather to adhere to the advice of experts in the field and to respect the community that will eventually have to support such a facility. Experts in drug addiction have testified before Parliament that for a drug consumption site to be effective and have any benefit, there must be a buy-in from the local community, a buy-in from the local law enforcement, and buy-in from local health officials. So let's stop for a moment and explain what these sites are. These sites are a designated place in which we allow people to cause harm to themselves while immune from the law of the land. You can shoot up with a deadly illegal drug so long as you do it at one of these facilities, one of these sites. You do the same thing a block away and you're breaking the law. So we must ask ourselves then, how do we allow certain people to break the law multiple times a day, and how do we square that with society's expectations as laid out in our criminal laws? How do we condone the use of illegal drugs as a society and then tell our kids that they are not good for you? Mr. Speaker, very few people who are offered help at these injection sites ever accept an offer for treatment. They don't want to give up their highs for the reality that await them. Of those that do enter treatment, even fewer see the program through. Of those that see the program through, even fewer actually stay clean. Mr. Speaker, I've had numerous conversations with addiction counselors in the past, and many have told me that the reality is finding someone who they can take from a drug abuser status to a somebody clean status is like finding a needle in a haystack. They say that in reality, most of these people currently addicted to drugs will die from their addictions. They may die earlier in life. They may develop health-related issues. They may die while engaged in crime to feed their addiction, or they may simply just overdose. These addiction counselors say that these sites, they do save lives, but then they question if they really do. If you save an addict's life today or tomorrow or next week, but then they die the week after from an overdose, did you really save that life at all? They suggested that these consumption sites are therefore not really a conduit to treatment, but rather facilities for self-destruction and abuse until the addiction wins the war on its victims. That is a sobering assessment, Mr. Speaker, of what we face. Therefore, we really need to target the source of this problem, as it appears rarely fixable after the fact. We need to prevent access to addictive substances before an addict develops. We need to stop this Liberal and this NDP attitude of acceptance when it comes to drugs. Instead of campaigning to make drugs legal, they should be campaigning to make it harder for folks to even get introduced to the world of drugs. I, along with my Conservative colleagues, have been pushing for this Liberal government to tackle the root of the cause, and that is the continuous flow of illegal drugs into our country and onto our streets. I was appalled, Mr. Speaker, when I introduced a motion in the Health Committee a few months back to get the Chinese ambassador to come and inform us and tell us what is his government doing to prevent deadly drugs from being shipped into Canada. Because 98% of illicit drugs are coming from China, Mr. Speaker, and all the Liberals on the committee could do was vote down the motion. And it was disheartening, it was disgraceful. This government is more concerned about being friends with the Chinese government than stopping the flow of deadly drugs on Canadian streets. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals and the NDP want to make it really easy to open up a drug consumption site by removing the safeguards and removing community consultations and turning a blind eye to the effect it will have on the community. You know, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, they want to remove all of the burden of proof from the applicants when it comes to opening up drug injection sites. But it's funny, they want all this less onerous application process for safe injection sites, yet they want to increase the burden on job-creating applicants when it comes to building pipelines. They argue that safe injection sites will save lives. Well, I say that getting pipelines built will save lives, as it will reduce our escalating suicide rate in Alberta. High unemployment and the despair in our oil patch is also costing lives. As I stated before, the experts are telling us that we need community buy-in for these facilities to be successful. So why do the Liberals and the NDP want to sneak these facilities into our communities without proper consultation? Now, drug consumption sites do have some benefit. They allow us to hide our problems away from the streets, and yes, they save addicts so that addicts can then fuel their addiction for another day. In very few cases, they also do facilitate a path for recovery. But let's not kid ourselves and believe that there is a lot of light at the end of this tunnel. These sites do help keep things like limiting dirty needles in our parks, and they do make it cheaper for the healthcare system to monitor and save some addicts. But what they don't do is reduce the drug problem in Canada. They don't stop people from becoming addicts. They very seldom get addicts off drugs, and they don't curtail the profits for organized crime. These sites are not a silver bullet. They are one very weak tool in our fight against addictions and their deadly toll. If we want these sites to have some positive benefit and improve outcomes, we need community buy-in, and this is done through open, transparent, and exclusive consultations. Sadly, it is not what this bill will do. It will weaken the existing legislation, and therefore I must vote against it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Len Webber.
Speaker, I want to thank the member for his speech. He's mentioned that the community's support, as stated by the Supreme Court, and I quote what he said, was not meant as a way to prevent safe consumption sites from opening. Indeed, it wasn't meant from to prevent the opening of safe consumption sites, and we've taken exactly the language that's in the Supreme Court judgment, which states that one of the factors to be taken into account is the expression of community support or opposition. What was meant to prevent these sites from opening were the 26 criteria in Bill C-2 that the previous government had put forward. And when he's mentioned that we've had 3 sites open in Montreal, does the member know how long it took for these sites to open? When we're facing a health crisis in Canada when it comes to opioids, it took nearly 2 years. I'll answer that question. It took nearly 2 years for these sites to open when the community was requesting it, the mayor, the provincial actors, as well as the health professionals in Montreal. So my question to him was just, is he at least aware of the time it took for these sites to be approved under the previous legislation? And also, while I have the floor, I must say that I'm always a bit challenged by the comparison that he's making with pipelines and these safe consumption sites. And when he talks about addicts, they are people. And sometimes the government, we have a responsibility to protect the people, sometimes from themselves. And that's what these safe consumption sites are all about. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Confederation.
I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question, and I will address that second point first with regard to comparison of the pipelines and to these safe injection sites. Now, the point that I was trying to make in committee, it was simple, although maybe difficult to express, and that was that I firmly believe that when applying for a pipeline or a drug injection site, the burden of proof should rest with the applicant and not the taxpayer. Now, I know that the NDP believe that those applying for pipelines, they must prove it to be in the public interest, that it is safe, and that strict operating conditions be applied. So I expect the same for those who want to open drug injection sites in our community too. So that was my point with regard to the pipelines. Now, with regard to community consultation and how long it took to get these facilities in Montreal, it may take time, honourable member, but we also know that there's a lot of NIMBYism in our communities, and I don't blame them. These facilities are magnets for the types of people and the types of activities that we work hard to shield from our children. That said, these facilities will have to go somewhere else then, on somebody else's street. So I think that the key thing here, honourable member, is that communities are properly consulted, and this legislation will not do that. So this is what the experts are telling us, honourable member, and this is why the Liberal government is so determined to move ahead without hearing from these key stakeholders.
Before going to more questions, I just want to remind the honourable members that you speak through the speaker, not directly across, even if you refer to him very politely, as was done earlier. Just go through the speaker. The honourable member for Courtenay, Alberni.
First, I want to thank my honourable colleague for raising his concern around drugs in our communities. I wish that we didn't have drugs in our communities. I share his concern. The war on drugs hasn't worked. That approach hasn't worked. Mr. Speaker, people are using drugs, hard drugs in our community. People that we know, people in our communities. I saw a man in downtown Vancouver that came from a good family in our community, and he was struggling with addiction, and he went to Insight. He went to a safe place to do drugs, and actually he ended up getting treatment and came home. And that was really important, that we know that we can save lives, Mr. Speaker. And I hope it's not the Conservative position that those who aren't ready or able to seek treatment today aren't worth saving. Under the Conservative government, and maybe the member can explain to this House, they cut 15% on addiction facilities. And we know that we have to take a multifaceted approach. We have to do what we can to stop drugs coming into our communities, to provide safe places for people to do drugs, for people to get the therapy and the addiction services they need. Does the member support me in that we need to take a multifaceted approach? But these facilities, no one has died at Insight. Nobody has died at this facility, and it's important that we take a holistic approach to tackling this problem. We've tried with education. We see children now doing drugs in Vancouver, and I hope the member will come to downtown East Side, and he'll meet people from my community, my rural community, that have ended up down there. and he'll see the benefits of this facility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Calgary Confederation in 45 seconds or less, if possible.
Well, I'd like to thank the honourable member for his question, and I will say to the honourable member through the Speaker, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, is that I have been down to Insight. I toured there over the summer. It was a disturbing sight. It was a sad sight, and of course, I agree with the work that they're doing at Insight, but my main point tonight was, Mr. Speaker, that we need to have community consultation when we implement other facilities like Insight into other communities around Canada. It was a disturbing tour that I was allowed to partake in with a number of colleagues. The police were there with me. We went into the back alleys in East Hastings, and I tell you, the work that they're doing is good work. The needles are being put away safely. They're provided with safe needles. They are monitored, and the naloxone is there if it's required. That is a good thing. But my point tonight was we need community consultation before we open up safe injection sites around Canada. Thank you.